Welcome to True Drew Podcast, your source for all things Nancy Drew. I'm your host, Avery, and on this podcast, we'll discuss everything from the Nancy Drew books, to computer games, to movie adaptations, and TV shows. Nothing is off the table. So if you're a True Drew, you'll definitely want to tune in for this podcast. Hello, True Drews, and welcome to another episode of the podcast. And today we're going to be talking about the mystery of the Ivory Charm. So this is the 13th book in the Nancy Drew series, and it was written in 1936. And I kind of already alluded to this in last week's episode, but this is an interesting book. There were parts of it that were a little bit hard to read and might be a little bit hard to talk about, but let's just say this book really dates itself. Nonetheless, I am up to the challenge, and we're going to jump right in and start talking about the covers of this book. There are 3, which I always post these covers on my Instagram the day before the episode airs, so on Wednesdays. And I like to get your all's take on which version is your favorite. So my Instagram handle is True Drew Podcast, and I would also like you to be over there anyway because I like to share a lot of funny memes and Nancy Drew related content. So for the first cover, which is the one from 1936, we have Nancy with the blonde waved short hair, and it looks like she's in a shack of some kind, and she's got some kind of paper that seems to be pulling from or putting into a tin can, and we see a man with a checkered shirt and a fedora walking away with a dog and a whip of some kind. The second version of this cover shows Nancy, Bess, and George at the circus, and a lot of this book revolves around this circus, and there is a man of Indian descent next to them, and he is holding the Ivory Charm, which is shaped like an elephant, and you can just make out the head of an elephant behind them in the background. For the third and final cover, which is the one that I grew up with on the flashlight edition, it's just a green background, and we have Nancy in the foreground wearing the ivory charm around her neck, and we see an elephant just kind of floating in the air back there, and then the disembodied head of Rye, who is a character in the book. So, of course, I came up with some funny cover spoofs, and for the original cover from the 1936 edition, I just said, the mystery of where's she going to hide those coupons, because it looks like she's hiding coupons in this tin can. It's kind of weird. For the second cover, I came up with the spoof of, I'm going to hypnotize you all with this dangling elephant necklace, because it kind of looks like that's what Rye is doing. And I came up with a third cover spoof because all of these covers were drastically different. So for that book cover edition, I said the mystery of why does Nancy look possessed, because she honestly does. I gave these book covers a rating of 1 magnifying glass. They are not my favorite, but also once we get into talking about what the subject matter is of this book, I don't know, just reading the book and then seeing the cover, it's just a very awkward book, but let's get into it. So the characters we have in this book are, of course, Bess and George. They tag along with Nancy to solve this mystery. There is Stanley Strong, who owns this circus. There's a young boy named Tommy, who they take to the circus. There is Rye, who we mentioned already. He's on the cover, and it's not really his son. It's like an adopted son, and his name is Rushi. I believe that's how you pronounce it. And there's Arun, the elephant. There's a character named Miss Allison, Steve Roach, who is her escort. I guess she can't go anywhere alone. And Jasper Bat, otherwise known as Old Batty, the caretaker. And he has a relative named Pete Putnam. So there's quite a few characters in this book, and usually I like that. Sometimes the books that have a lot of characters are very good. They have a lot going for them and, a lot of plot devices that forward the book. But, this is still not a good book despite that. So I'll go ahead and jump in and read the synopsis that I came up with. Nancy is told by her father that a client, Stanley Strong, thinks some illegal activities are going on with his Bingleton Wild Animal Show and wants them investigated, so Nancy, Bess, and George and a neighborhood boy, Tommy, attend the show. They meet Rye, a sinister and stern man, and his talented adopted son, Rushi, who works with the elephants. Rye seems to be abusive towards his son, or Nancy suspects he is. Tommy gets a little too close to an elephant, and after the girls return home, Nancy is alarmed to find Rushi in her trunk. Rye mysteriously quits the animal show, and Nancy and her family are now weirdly responsible for Rushi. Some woman named Miss Allison shows up and sees the elephant charm Nancy is wearing and faints. Rushi stole it from Rye and gave it to Nancy. Next, Nancy is told by her father that Miss Allison has a property that may be turned into a golf course. The girls go to investigate it, only to find a hollow house full of trapeze apparatus, underground tunnels, and a crazy caretaker. Nancy suspects Miss Allison knows Rye and begins to suspect Rushi may be descended from a Maharaja. Miss Allison's house burns down, and Nancy and Carson get stuck in a tunnel collapse trying to help her save her jewels. Nancy and the others visit the animal show, and Rushi helps prevent the elephants from stampeding. The next day, he is kidnapped from the Drew home. Nancy devises a plan to trap Miss Allison after getting information from Jasper Bat on the location of some important papers, which incriminate Allison and Rye of kidnapping Rushi from India. Nancy gets Rushi's tutor to invite Miss Allison over, and she condemns her with the evidence. Allison hits the professor over the head and runs away. Rushi returns briefly, only to be kidnapped again. Miss Allison jumps off a bridge to try and get away from the police. Rye tries to kill Rushi, and then Nancy and Rushi's long-lost father, Mr. Talak, save him with some anti-poison in the Ivory Charm. So yeah, there's a lot going on in this book. But I came up with a newspaper headline synopsis, which is basically decades-long political coup overthrown, Maharaja reunited with long-lost son thanks to River Heights team. Now, I have some direct quotes and notes from this book, but I am going to preface this by saying there are a lot of racist stereotypes in this book, and that's pretty much the reason why I didn't like it. And aside from that, the plot was not very good, but there may be some derogatory terms. I've tried to kind of filter some of them out towards people from India, so that's unfortunate. Now, the first note that I took down is the first time Nancy's hair has been referred to as strawberry blonde and not Titian. I thought that was interesting that that was mentioned in this book, because up to this point, it's either been described as blonde or Titian, but not strawberry blonde. I've also been taking down all these context clues about the Drew's house, and the Drew's house is apparently 3 stories, because they mention Rushi goes to stay on the 3rd story in their guest bedroom. But I thought that the Drew's house was at least 2 stories, but 3. I'm like, wow, got some money there. My next note is just Mr. Drew says, "Don't let Tommy get into any mischief," and then the kid literally climbs up an elephant's trunk. So, Tommy has helped Nancy solve some previous mysteries. We've mentioned him, I believe, in the clue in the diary, but this day he wasn't doing Nancy any favors. My next note is, I like that it's just assumed that Rushi's father is Indian. He could have been any nationality, and his mother could have been the one from India. I thought this was odd that the Drews just jumped to this conclusion, but it's even weirder that they jumped to the conclusion that he is the son of a Maharaja. I mean, we start to get clues that that is the case, but it was a little bit wild. Okay, so this next note kind of deals with some of the problematic stereotypes that are rampant in this book, but Rushi speaks really broken English, which is such a sad stereotype and so awkward. I said it was honestly kind of disgusting to read. And yeah, this part was very hard. It was just very broken English, and I just thought it wasn't needed. It could have been so much more tactfully handled. He could have spoken completely normally. It was just a weird detail in this book that I felt was kind of inappropriate. My next note is Rushi hid in the trunk of Nancy's car. What the heck? Like, he just jumped in there. This kid was so desperate to get out of the circus that he was like, you know what? I'm going to hide in the trunk of this car of these American teenagers, and I'm just going to go live with them. Some people run away to join the circus. Some people run away to get out of the circus. My next note is Nancy, Bess, and George take Rushi, and they go to investigate Miss Allison's property, and they find a hollow house with nets and trapeze paraphernalia and apparently tunnels underground that lead to a door in a rock. Pretty crazy. Oh, but just you wait, it gets even crazier. My next note is Miss Allison is annoying. After the tunnels under the burned house cave in on them, she starts crying about her treasures, which, spoiler alert, aren't even hers. But I was like, who buries a bunch of jewels instead of putting them in a safe? And then she starts going on about meditating and reincarnation, and it's very apparent just from the description and some of the other things. I mean, the woman's name, she's white, and it's just very, I don't know, it was just very awkward. She kind of parades through this book and wears a lot of traditional Indian clothing, and it's just done in a very disrespectful way. So I really don't like her character, and I really don't like this book. So my next note is George says if she came back, like if she was reincarnated, she'd be a goat, which I thought was a little bit funny. Not funny that she's mocking other cultures, but funny that she thinks that she would be a goat. The next thing that I wrote down is that the elephant Arun runs into the stands, and Rushi says it's because he smells rye and hates him, which I thought was kind of funny because Rushi has this relationship with the elephant. They trust each other. There's obviously a bond there, but the elephant apparently hates rye. Rushi was also apparently kidnapped in a plot by Miss Allison and Rai, and is descended from a Maharaja, and they told people he was eaten by a tiger. Like, as if you didn't have a reason to hate this woman enough. She's meddling in the political affairs and dealings of another country, which she's not a native of, and then she just separates this man from his son and causes political unrest, and it's just like, yeah, he got eaten by a tiger. She's a real gem. Also, Peter Putnam, who is a relative of the caretaker, Old Batty, he gets a whip and he uses it to call this dog off of Bess. So not only do we have racial stereotypes in this book, we have some animal abuse. So great. I also found it funny that the insurance guys in this book just take Nancy's word for it because she's Carson's daughter, and they say no explanation is needed. Like, Nancy just has to throw her name around and people just jump. Also, Ned gets annoyed when all these guys want to dance with Nancy at his fraternity party. So Ned shows off that he's very jealous in the next few books. That's all I'll say, but he was pretty jealous that Nancy was not dancing with him. So Miss Allison wears a turban, or I believe the Indian name is a pagri. And I was like, this is so disrespectful. She goes into all this chanting, and it's so weird. And my last note is Nancy says she never solves mysteries for anything except the sheer delight of it, which, makes sense because she never takes any kind of money or anything for solving these mysteries. Now, for the add that to your resume section of this episode, I put that Nancy is an expert swimmer. She has to swim after Miss Allison after she jumps off of a bridge. And she's also a high beam climber. She's climbing all this trapeze apparatus to save Rushi when he gets tied up in some of these ropes. And yeah. And then I put that Nancy is great at helping reunite families, because she does at the end of the book reunite Rushi with his father, which is the one bright spot in this entire book. I mean, the kid almost got poisoned by rye right before it, but there's a bright spot. Now for the What's Cooking with Hannah Gruen section of this podcast episode, Hannah did a little bit of cooking. She made some tea and cakes, apparently, and then she burned some bacon, which was very uncharacteristic of her. I think this is when Rushi got kidnapped and she panicked. She didn't realize that he had been taken from the house, and so, understandably, she burned the bacon. Now for the things that I liked about this book. Nothing. I really did not like this book. It was not an enjoyable book. It was so awkward to read through these racial stereotypes, and I just did not like it. So for the things I didn't like, racial stereotypes is at the top of the list. Poor plot, and Miss Allison. She's literally the worst character. I mean, she upset the Indian political system, and she told everyone that this boy was killed, and she's like one of the worst people, and she stole all these jewels. I could go on and on. But yeah, I gave this book a 1 magnifying glass rating. I should probably just give it a 0. It was honestly one of the worst Nancy Drew books that I've read up to this point. I didn't enjoy it. It was just awkward to read. I did not like it. And I'm sorry if this episode's a little bit shorter because of that, but it was a bit of a stretch to even talk about some of the things that we've talked about today. But, I knew that getting into these books, some of them been written in the 1930s and then revised in the 1950s and 60s, we would be dealing with some of these harder topics. And obviously, when you're reading these things have changed and things are written differently back then because that's how a lot of people thought or believed, but it still doesn't make it any easier to consume in today's age. So yeah, that concludes this episode. I'm sorry that this was a little bit of a harder episode, but next week we're going to be talking about The Whispering Statue, and it is a much better book. There's still some problematic things with it, but it's overall a better book. So until next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of True Drew Podcast. If you'd like to stay up to date on the latest information and new episodes, our Instagram is True Drew Podcast. Or for general inquiries, you can email us at truedrewpodcast@gmail.com.